Hi everyone, I'm Ted Danola, Developer Evangelist here at Xsolla. In this video, we'll be covering integrating SDK 3 for native iOS. Here's what we'll be covering today. First, your prerequisites and setup. Second, authentication. Third, loading your catalog. Fourth, purchasing products. Fifth, finalizing your purchase. And finally, recapping everything we've learned. Here's what you'll need to follow along. First, make sure you've installed a current, stable version of Xcode. Next, you'll need a store-ready Swift or SwiftUI iOS project. For this demonstration, you should only be targeting iPhone and iPad. And make sure you have your StoreKit asset set up with all of your product identifiers ready to go. Here's the game I'll be working with today. Kardashev Rising is a classic incremental clicker. Players start by clicking a reactor button to generate resources. Resources can be used to buy generators to make more resources. You can also use a soft currency called Stardust to purchase buildings or rush actions. Want more Stardust? Go to the store and purchase some packages. By the end of this video, you'll have all the tools you need to get a flow just like this built into your native iOS game. Next up, you'll want to make sure that you've already created your Xsolla Publisher account. This is where we'll configure our application and our item catalog. And finally, we'll be using the Xsolla SDK iOS XC framework. Some useful resources as you go through this video. First, you should take a look at our mobile SDK documentation. It includes an iOS Quick Start guide, installation details for the SDK, configuration details, how to build the buy button, and how to handle purchase validation. Throughout this video, we'll also be heavily referencing the SDK Explorer. The SDK Explorer gives you a live demo right in your browser. On the left side, we have our game, and on the right, we have logs of in-game events, from Unity IIP to Xsolla SDK calls. First, let's configure this for our demo. Go to the top center, and make sure to select the following settings. Make sure platform is iOS. Set your country appropriately. Make sure your store is set to App Store. Set your engine to none. Make sure use server login is disabled. Set webhook mode to off. Set buy button to off and browser mode to external. When you're done, click Apply Changes. You'll immediately see the logs start to populate with events. For example, here's our initialization step that we'll be covering during authentication. Here we're loading our products into the catalog and confirming that loading. You can play the game, and events will happen as you play it. Let's try to fire off a purchase. I'll open the store here and buy this booster pack for $9. We can see the purchase started call right here, and there's the details of the call. Once I confirm the transaction, we'll see the rest of the process flow on through. Payment status was checked, the purchase was validated, and the purchase was consumed. And you can see that I had it rewarded directly to me. Let's double check our configuration for each of the 4 steps. Go to Authenticate, hit Configure, and make sure we're in client-side auth. For Load Catalog, go to Configure, and for this demo, set it to Manual Entry. For Purchase Product, go to Configure, make sure we're set to External Browser. And finally, for Finalize Purchase, go to Configure, and confirm we're on client-side validation. With these resources at hand, let's get started by installing the SDK. In Xcode, go to File and Add Package Dependencies. Enter the repository URL. Set the dependency role to up to next major version and click Add Package. Select the Xsolla Mobile SDK and add it to your target. Let's roll Kardashev back to before SDK 3 was integrated. All we have is a test catalog. Let's kick off the first step, authentication. I'll head back over to the SDK Explorer to see what it has to say. Click the Authenticate tab at the bottom of the screen. Kardashev is already set up for StoreKit, so we have an SK payment queue as you'd expect. What we need to add is a new SK payment settings object, configured to our project and login project ID. Once you have your settings object created, there's a few other properties you'll want to set. First, during development and testing, set Use Sandbox to true. This will enable the test environment and allow you to use test credit cards for transactions. Make sure to set Enable Payments to true. If this is disabled, things will fail silently. Finally, set Open External Browser to true for compliance with US storefronts. Let's hop back over to Kardashev to see how I built this in-game. For better extensibility, I'm wrapping everything in an Xsolla Store Provider class. Here you can see the init function taking in a project ID, login project ID, and whether or not we're in sandbox mode. I then pass the project ID and login project ID into the constructor and set each property as needed. Next, we'll be starting the SK payment queue, passing in our settings, and adding ourselves as an observer. And here's that same setup inside of Kardashev. For client-side device-based anonymous authentication, you'll want to set a custom user ID. This can be any unique identifier string, such as a device ID or a player nickname. For Kardashev, I added a player user ID to my store manager. On first launch, this generates a unique user ID and stores it in the user defaults, persisting it for future sessions. Then I added it to the bottom of my settings. Next, we'll want to set up our URL schemes and redirects so we can handle callbacks from PayStation. Open Xcode, select your target, and go to its Info tab. Go down to the URL type section, add a new one, and set the URL schemes to match your product bundle identifier. Next, we'll have to wire that in to two properties on your settings object. Set settings.payments_redirect_URL to your bundle identifier, :// Xsolla_confirm/payment. Then set settings.redirect_URL to your bundle identifier, :// auth/callback. Once again, here's what it looks like in Xcode. And finally, to respect the callback, add an onOpenURL call, calling skpaymentqueue.default.openURL. And with that, our settings object is configured. Hopping back into the game, not much has changed. We're authenticated, but we don't have any items yet and we're not loading them in. Let's do that next. Step number 1 is actually making some items, so let's head on over to our publisher account. Select your project, or create one now, and navigate to its items catalog. You can import your items via JSON, or if you have an existing project, import them directly from PlayFab, App Store Connect, or Google Play. But for this demonstration, we're going to create them directly within the web interface. Select Create Manually, and make sure to choose Virtual Item, then Continue. Here you'll have fields for images, SKU, name, and description. For this demo, set it up as a paid item, and then make sure to assign it a default price. I'm going with 99 cents as this is my entry-level package. There are several other settings you can configure, but let's submit this one as is. And we can now see it in our item catalog. Make sure to set it to available so that it shows up when we query for products. I'll skip ahead here and show you my fully populated catalog. Go ahead and do the same, or continue with one. Now that we're set up on the publisher account side, it's time to integrate it into our application. Let's head back to the SDK Explorer and open the Load Catalog tab to see what we need to do. As Kardashev is already set up to use StoreKit, we don't actually have to make any changes. That said, let's take a look at setting it up yourself. After authentication, create a new SK product request and pass in your product identifiers as an array of strings. Note that these are case sensitive, so make sure they match exactly with your publisher account settings, where the products will not be found. Finally, set the delegate for your request and start it. My actual implementation inside of Kardashev looks a little bit different, but is essentially the same. We have a small sleep to make sure that things are fully set up before we try to load the catalog, and then do some logging. I've added a try block so that we can handle failures a little more gracefully, and create an intermediate handler for the delegate so that we can handle continuation during things like internet interruption or bad reception. Putting those project-specific changes aside, though, I set the delegate to my handler and then start the request. While the authentication step wasn't super impressive visually, here we can now see our full catalog loading into the game. If you've been following along and your catalog is not loading, here are a few common mistakes we can investigate. First, in the publisher account, make sure all of your items are set to available. Also make sure every item is a virtual item. Other item types, such as currency packages, will not be returned by the SDK. Double check your project ID and login ID and make sure they match exactly. An invalid ID will still lead to a connection, but no items will be returned. Also double check for SKU mismatches. Make sure that you're matching case exactly. With our catalog loading, it's time to bring our store to life by handling product purchasing. Taking a look back at SDK Explorer, we can see that once again, we don't have to make any changes if we're already set up for StoreKit. Let's walk through the full flow, starting with initiating a purchase. If you're already set up for StoreKit, you're calling SKPayment and passing in your products in order to kick that off. It's important to note here that SKPayment queue does call UIKit, and therefore needs to run on the main thread. Before dispatching, set your root view controller to your top view controller, then dispatch to main. Here's my full purchase function inside of Kardashev. We do some logging, and once again have a try block for safety and continuation, but then I set the root view controller, handle the dispatch queue, grab the payment, and pass it into the payment queue. With this setup, you may notice that your first transaction takes a little bit longer than others, so a brief aside on pre-warming as best practice. DNS, TLS, order creation, and kicking off your Safari view controller altogether can take several seconds from a cold start. Present since iOS 15, use sfsafari view controller.prewarm connections to start pre-warming. Use URL session to store the API, and then call load products at configure time to warm the authentication handshake. Now that we're populating the queue, we need to actually handle it. This is where the observer we set up during authentication comes back into play. For each transaction in the queue, we need to switch over their transaction state and handle appropriately. Note that we should always call finished transaction. Unfinished transactions will redeliver every single launch until they are consumed. For a real-world implementation, let's see how I built this in Kardashev. First, we loop over every transaction and then switch over their transaction states. Once again, while I'm doing some steps for continuation here, it's still mostly the same. I grab the product ID from the transaction, call finish transaction to consume the event, and then hand it off to be granted. Failure looks very similar. I grab the product ID once again, still call finish transaction, and then handle the error appropriately. Your SKPayment settings object also has some properties for PayStation theming. While not required, I wanted to match Kardashev's dark style, and so set the appropriate values. Going into the market, we can now try to purchase any of our items, and PayStation will open appropriately. Let's move on to our final step, finishing our transactions. Heading back over to the SDK Explorer, we can see that the most important step here is calling finish transaction. However, validation is also important and strongly recommended. Heading over to the configuration, we can see that for client-side validation, all we need to do is call validate transaction on the queue. To implement this in your project, go back to your process queue, and for the purchase case, wrap your item granting in a validate transaction call. For Kardashev, I created a helper function to wrap my existing purchased flow inside of a validate transaction block. Let's see how this looks in the final game. Heading back into Kardashev, I'll open up the market and choose an item. How about this tasty Stardust Singularity package? PayStation opens, and we can click to confirm the transaction. It processes, is successful, and my 50,000 Stardust is delivered. With just 4 simple steps, I took my StoreKit game and made it fully compatible with the Xsolla platform. With all that Stardust at their disposal, players can accelerate a little bit and get themselves to the next stage of the game. Let's recap everything we've learned today. The first of our 4 steps is authentication. You'll create your SK payment settings object, passing in your project ID and login project ID. Be sure to configure other properties, like enabling payments, setting open external browser to true for US storefront compliance, and, during testing, setting use sandbox to true. For client-side authentication, we'll set a custom user ID, which can be any unique identifier. You'll then kick off the SK payments queue, passing in your settings and adding an observer. We'll then set up our URL schemes and redirect, first adding a new scheme to our project, then wiring in the redirects to our settings, and making sure that we're handling it properly. Moving on to our next step, we'll handle loading our catalog. First, we'll head to our publisher account and create some virtual items. Then, within our application, we use skparticles_request, passing in all of our SKUs to pull the items down. If things aren't loading at that point, we'll check to make sure all items are available, are of the correct virtual item type, and check for matching on our project ID, login ID, and all of our SKUs. Moving on to our third step, we'll set up purchasing products, starting with initiating a purchase. We'll pass the requested product into the SK payment call, running that on the main thread. Within our observer, we'll loop over every transaction and process them according to their state, remembering to always call finish transaction to consume it. Moving on to our last step, we'll call validate transaction before granting any items in order to properly finalize our purchase. Authenticate, load catalog, purchase product, and finalize purchase. These 4 simple steps are all you need to integrate SDK3 with your native iOS project. Once again, I'm Ted Denola here at Xsolla, and thank you so much for watching. Enjoy the game.